Hi everyone! Thanks for stopping by. Today I'm going to do a little tutorial on how to make a 3D game ready asset. So without further ado, let's get on into it. Today I'm focusing on making a simple toast model, and how I always end up starting off any project is I typically will use Autodesk Maya, but you're obviously more than welcome to use any 3D program. So here you see me getting the basic shape. I'm only working on about a quarter of the model. I really want to be efficient with my use of time, and I in practicality it's just a good habit to try having. Um I pretty much go through, make all the basic shapes, basic kind of silhouette. If I have any endgons, I go through and clean those up, since I beveled those corners. And I'm pretty much also going through and doing a camera project on my UVs and just making simple cuts and sews throughout the model to prep it for when it gets mirrored. I personally like doing this just because it does, I find it more optimal in time and just good workflow to try and think smarter and not harder in a sense. And here you can see when I mirror it, I pretty much have a good definition of the shape on one side. And I go ahead and when I mirror that, I will add additional geometry since I don't really want pointy toast. I went ahead, did a little bit of adjustments on those UVs so it's not too jarring, to have like one piece of like the cut slice of bread to be completely obvious that it's mirrored. So I went ahead and just made that one UV shell. Um, Here I'm just adding a couple additional details, just to give the model like some type of narrative rather than just being a piece of toast. So I was thinking of like, oh, a nice morning breakfast. So that's kind of the narrative I am going with. I have reference on the other screen, just keeping mindful of, you know, what toast actually looks like, a kind of plate inspiration where I want to go with when I start texturing, things of that nature. And here I'm kind of being a little bit unsure on how I wanted to do the UVs at first, but I ultimately decided to just pack everything, the butter, the plate, and the toast, all to be on the same UV. And I'm going to go ahead and just start naming them, properly naming conventions, as well as centering my pivot point, as well as clearing my history. I find that when I don't freeze my transformations or clear my history, that I typically have problems within my models. Some freaky things can end up happening. So here I kind of just wanted to go ahead and get ready to texture. I do not have a high poly model, but sometimes what I like to do in Substance Painter is just go ahead and I do a low bake. So essentially what this does is just like it reads the low poly model and it will use that as a bake in it of itself. So this will allow me to kind of be able to have curvature already applied. If I wanted to use any of the smart materials, I can definitely go ahead and do that now. I just find it personally, a nice touch, and I like the overall look. So I'm gonna go ahead and I will start adding some base colors. Around this process, I usually do a lot of like trial and error, kind of see what works and what doesn't work. Color palettes, I start getting a good overall feel for what is gonna work. And typically when I am doing my base colors in Substance Painter, there's a fun little option. I believe it is the fifth option down, on your toolbar in Substance Painter on the left, at least I have it on the left, will allow you to be able to just use polygons to paint. So you can either just apply one base color to an entire model, or you could use the option of doing just individual polygons, which is nice, especially for the situation of the white part of the bread, because it's nice to be like, okay, this is where my overall baseline is going to be, to where the edge of the crust is going to start coming in. And since I really don't like the harsh lines of using the polygons to fill, I do go ahead and I start hand painting details and kind of giving a lot more uniqueness to it, rather than just leaving it as is. Because it's definitely a look if you want those harsh lines, but personally, that is not something I wanted within this model, and I did also want to do some hand painting practice. So I found this as a good opportunity to really utilize that. Here I'm just going in and I want to start adding some like various little details. I do want to keep it pretty stylized, so I am just really looking through the available brushes and alphas that are on Substance Painter to see if it will give me the kind of look I'm trying to achieve. Just be mindful, I am also using a Yunior tablet to do all my hand painting. I'm not using my mouse to do any of it. I have done that before. It's possible, but it's very tricky and difficult. So, I definitely recommend, if you're gonna be focusing on hand painted assets, to definitely invest in some type of drawing tablet. Here I am still continuing on adding details. I always, almost always, when I go ahead and like add details or do anything within Substance Painter, especially with details, I really love using the filters. And I definitely try working as non-destructively as possible. So what I mean by non-destructive is essentially like, if you notice on my layers in the top right of the screen, I have everything masked out, and that's on a paint layer in that specific layer itself. So as you can see, I have the toasted layer right now. The bottommost layer is a paint layer, and that is essentially my absolute base masks, where I am using that material on, if that makes sense. So essentially if I don't want that on there anymore, I could just as easily hide it, or just remove it, or copy paste it somewhere else. It works really, really nicely when you're like me and you kind of like just having that option of being able to see what happens when I do a painting technique one way, and then I put another paint layer under that mask, and I try to do it another way, and it's a very nice way to be able to easily compare the two options, or if I want to use both, etc. So I definitely recommend try to work as non-destructive as possible. It is just a good work habit to have, and it's something I really try to do, and it can become quite cluttered on your screen, but overall it's definitely worth it. Kind of going off of that, as you can see for some of these other layers, I have filters attached above the paint. So a lot of times, like for that noise I added with the texture brush, I had another paint layer for that, and I went ahead and used the filter. So I used the non-slope blur it's the blur slope filter, which is absolutely my 100% go-to. I feel like any stylized artist will slap a blur slope onto something and call it a day. And of course, add a little like pizzazz here and there, but blur slope is your best friend. And I'll go through and I'll even sometimes add levels, or I will add another blur just to kind of like smooth it out a bit, and just kind of play with some of the other filters that are available to you. Here I redid some of my UVs. I didn't like how it was what was happening. Here I'm just trying to fix that seam that's going on in between the crust and the base of the toast. So that's kind of what's happening right now. I'm rebaking it, making sure everything's proper because the UVs are updated. I re-imported the mesh. So anytime, a good habit to have, especially if you did update the UVs, is to always rebake your mesh. Even if you're using it for this example as your low poly model using that. So here I am going ahead and just kind of like brainstorming on how I want the details on the plate to be. I don't want it to be too noisy, but I definitely want to have some options in regards to like having some subtle detail. So I'm really just going through the alphas available to me on Substance Painter. I also have some of my own alphas that are included here, but I'm just going around, and as you can tell in my top right corner, those paint layers under the mask that I'm working on right now is kind of what I was talking about. So I'm using individual paint layers to work non-destructively and be able to get rid of the last one I wanted, or add this one without having to do a whole nother material. So it kind of minimizes the amount of materials you're working with, but and it's also a nice way to be able to see what's working and what isn't working. So that's why you see so many paint layers over there. Some are hidden, some aren't. So it's personally something I really like to utilize in this program. And I definitely try to adapt it into any other program. Here, I'm just going ahead and projecting some noise onto this little butter stick. I really felt it just needed a little something else. It felt a little too basic as is. So I'm going ahead and just like kind of messing with the blend layer, messing with the color, the opacity of the blend layer, and just what's working. So pretty much from here, it's going to be a lot of just really touching up, adding color variation. I go through and add some highlights. If it was a more intricate model or had more intricate details, I would probably go ahead and sorry if you can hear my cat. If this was a different model, I probably would paint a lot more shadows and highlights. But since it is pretty basic, and I did want to keep the models separate if needed, or if I wanted to add it into Unreal and add a blueprint to the toast and be able to pick it up or do X, Y, and Z thing with it. So I didn't want to paint too much shadows. Here I'm just going ahead. This is what happened when I re-imported it. The UV shells kind of shifted around a bit, so I'm just going ahead and cleaning those up. So yeah, so something I like to do is for making game ready assets is kind of this workflow. So a lot of times I will focus on making a very basic low poly model. And whether that needs to be more detailed or unique, that is a different story. Those are case by case, but for low poly models, even if it's going to be in the background or something, I typically like to do this workflow. I think it overall provides a good quality for any kind of low poly game, or a good quality for what I'm going for in this specific instant. There's always going to be a bunch of different ways of creating models, doing workflows. This is just one of many, so there's definitely no right or wrong way. And of course, depending on what software you use, that can really change results of things, or will change how you're viewing tutorials. So just something to be mindful in that regards. I've done plenty of different types of workflows, but for this situation, I think this is a good option. Sometimes instead of Substance Painter, I'll just go straight to Adobe Photoshop even, or if you have an iPad, like I do use Procreate sometimes. There's a couple of different ways of utilizing that kind of workflow. If you are interested in seeing a workflow where you're texturing via Procreate or via Photoshop, definitely let me know in the comments. I would love to make another tutorial or time-lapse video and just kind of doing a voiceover, explaining my thoughts and processes, and hopefully giving some inspiration or kind of spark of, or invigoration, I guess, of how to go about a project. I think this is just a fun way of getting some hand painted aspects. Since I do focus on stylized models, I would love to, keep showing different ways of creating stylized models. And I love being able to share any knowledge I can pass along. I love being able to share knowledge that I have learned throughout the years and can pass along. Anyways, enough of my yapping. Right now I'm just going ahead and adding some highlights, some little more, so to say, like oomph or a little more pizzazz to it, just so it doesn't feel so flat. And I'm just going through and I'm really trying to blur some of that out. And don't forget, when you are using the blur tool in Substance Painter, that you can change your brush and of course your stroke opacity on these. You definitely utilize the stroke opacity quite a bit throughout this project. I found myself finding it easier to go lower and then just keep working on it versus like going on a heavy stroke and then Control Z, Control Z, Control Z. So this is pretty much a simple workflow or pipeline into creating a low poly game ready asset. Of course, you can apply these techniques into any model, any aspect. I really just wanted to give a voiceover description of kind of my thought process throughout it. I have done a lot more text for my time lapse, so I'm hopeful that this might be a little more resourceful for some folks. And I'm really excited to be able to have the opportunity and chance to share some of my workflow or some of my experiences and knowledge with y'all. Style guide. The style guide is such a good resource. Definitely utilize it. And if a studio does not have it, don't sweat it. I've been in plenty of situations where studios do not have it or they're very loose. Definitely in that regards, ask plenty of questions, find good references. So going ahead, I'm just like adding some final touches, really seeing what I can utilize in the filters. I did find a nice stylized filter I was using to get some faked lighting, and some gradients. I think utilizing gradients is super helpful nice stylized touch that can really push your models to the next level. Here, I just went ahead and I wanted to add color variation, especially to the plate. I found it super dull without adding like a little bit of pinks and a little bit of blues. Typically, I would go a little harder, but again, since I am unsure if I want to progress with this model and create blueprints for it in Unreal, I'm a little hesitant on creating anything too dramatic in color variation. Here is where I had everything individually exported as separate models. So I had the butter, the piece of bread, and the plate, all separate models. I then wanted a model with all three together to be one solid object, and that is how I was going to export it. So I can then render it in Marmoset with it all together. So that is the process. When I also do combine it all together, I don't combine all three pieces, all three meshes together. I typically just group them. I make sure their pivot points are accurate per static mesh. And then for the group itself, I make sure that is a centered pivot. From the group itself and export it that way. So if you're gonna export via group, make sure you highlight and select all your individual static meshes within that group, and make sure then you select the group last. So typically what I'll do is like shift left click my most bottom of the hierarchy static mesh in the group, and then I'll select all the way up to the top to the group itself. So I'm making sure that I'm grabbing the specific pivot point to the group. Otherwise, if you do it the opposite, you do it from top to bottom of the hierarchy in the group, you'll end up exporting it out with the pivot point of whatever static mesh was on the bottom. So hopefully that little tip and trick is helpful. I really genuinely appreciate everybody's time to listening to me, and I again really hope that this was resourceful. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them down below. This is the first time I've done a voiceover, so any and all feedback is extremely appreciated. And definitely, if you guys want to see anything else specific, again, like if you want to see anything with using a Photoshop workflow or using Procreate as a workflow, I'm super ecstatic and gung-ho to try utilizing that. So, all right. Thank you so much, everybody. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.